One wildfire in eastern Oregon grew by roughly 150,000 acres in a single day. That's more ground than the city of Chicago sits on, scorched between one sunrise and the next. Right now, that fire has around 65 people assigned to it. No dedicated hand crews, no helicopters, just a handful of engines trying to slow down something the size of a small county. Nobody's ignoring it. There's simply nobody left to send. The American wildfire system just hit the highest level on its own 5-point scale earlier in the season than almost any year on record. And 2 states alone are holding more than half of everything burning in the entire country. Here's exactly how that happened and what happens next if the wind doesn't let up. Earlier this month, the National Interagency Fire Center, the federal agency that tracks and coordinates every wildfire response in the country, raised the nation to what's called Preparedness Level 5. That's the top of the scale. There is no Level 6. This isn't a measure of temperatures or how much land is burning. It's essentially an inventory count, a formal statement about people, engines, aircraft, and management teams. When that national coordination group declares Level 5, they're saying 3 specific things. Most of the country's wildland firefighting resources are already committed. Beware, different regions can no longer reliably lend each other help, and international crews are being called in because domestic reserves are running thin. In plain terms, the safety net most people never think about, the one that quietly moves firefighters and engines wherever fires break out, has essentially run dry. This is only the 4th time since 2010 that the country has reached this level of strain by the 18th of July, and officials are calling it unusually early for the season to already be maxed out like this. Normally, the worst stretch of a western fire season lands in August and September, not the last week of July. Reaching the ceiling this early means there's still a long, hot, dry streak of calendar left to get through with nothing extra held in reserve. A Forest Service spokesperson has publicly acknowledged that hitting this level earlier than usual increases pressure on national resources, while maintaining that the overall response system was built to handle exactly this kind of strain and is functioning as designed. That may be true on paper, but being designed to handle strain and actually having enough people and equipment on the ground are 2 very different things, and the numbers coming out of Oregon and Washington this week suggest the gap between those 2 ideas is widening by the day. It also helps to understand how unusual it is for a single region to dominate a national emergency this completely. In a typical difficult fire year, the strain spreads out. California carries a heavy load one month, the Northern Rockies pick up the slack the next, and international crews from Canada or Australia rotate in to plug specific gaps. This year, almost the entire burden has landed on one corridor, stretching from eastern Oregon up through north-central Washington, with Colorado carrying a smaller but still serious seconding airy load. That kind of geographic concentration is exactly what breaks a mutual aid system built around the assumption that trouble spreads out rather than piling up in one place. Right now, Oregon and Washington are functioning as their own separate emergency inside the national one. The Pacific Northwest is the only region sitting at that same top preparedness level alongside the nation as a whole. Every other region, Alaska, the Southwest, Northern California, the Rockies, the Great Basin, is sitting at a lower, more manageable level. 2 states are effectively carrying the entire national crisis on their shoulders, while the rest of the country watches from a safer position on the scale. Look at the actual numbers and the imbalance becomes obvious fast. Across the country right now, there are roughly 90 large uncontained wildfires burning, worked by more than 25,000 firefighters and support personnel, along with hundreds of engines, dozens of helicopters, and dozens of the specialized management teams brought in to run the biggest and most complicated incidents. Oregon alone is dealing with well over 1 million acres burned this season and dozen sci-fied as complexes, where multiple fires are managed together because they're close enough to threaten merging into one. Put the Northwest's numbers against the national totals, and you land on a simple, almost unbelievable sentence. 2 states are holding a majority of every acre currently burning in an active large fire in America, and a majority of every wildland firefighter deployed anywhere in the country, all while personnel keep getting pulled away from calmer regions and funneled north. Now here's the fire that should genuinely stop you. It's called the Big Grass Fire, and it's burning in the high desert rangeland of Malheur County in eastern Oregon, right up against the Idaho border, not far from the small community of Jordan Valley. It started from what officials believe was a lightning strike in late July. A whit. In a matter of hours, it exploded. Reports show it climbing from roughly 130,000 acres one evening to around 220,000 acres by that same night, and by the following day, it had grown even further, sitting somewhere around 280,000 to 300,000 acres. That's well over 400 square miles, larger than several major American cities combined, burned in essentially 2 to 3 days. Containment on a fire that size sits at just 5%. Different agencies tracking the fire haven't always agreed on the exact acreage from hour to hour, with some feeds showing figures tens of thousands of acres apart on the very same day. That's not sloppy record keeping. It's simply what happens when a fire is spreading steer than the satellites and aircraft trying to map its edges can keep up. The honest way to describe it is that big grass has been somewhere in the range of 200,000 to nearly 300,000 acres, depending on exactly when and how the measurement was taken. And that uncertainty itself tells you something about how violently this fire has been moving. The blaze has since pushed across the state line entirely, prompting evacuation orders in both Oregon and neighboring Idaho, with several rural communities and a stretch of interstate highway forced to close at different points as the fire crossed nearby roads. And here's the number that makes this whole story make sense. Despite covering close to 300,000 acres, the big grass fire has only around 65 to roughly 130 personnel assigned to it, depending on the day, a couple of hand crews, a handful of bulldozers, and about a dozen engines. The estimate cost of the suppression effort so far comes out to a few $100,000, which works out to just a couple of dollars for every acre burned. Compare that to other fires burning in the exact same state on the exact same days. Smaller fires, some barely an eighth the size of big grass, have well over 1,000 personnel, dozens of crews, and multiple helicopters assigned to them, with suppression costs running into the tens of millions of dollars. One much smaller Oregon fire, at a fraction of the size of big grass, has already cost tens of millions of dollars to fight, and has close to 500 people working it. That gap isn't incompetence, and it isn't carelessness. It comes down to how the national system allocates its stretched resources once it hits the top of the scale. Under preparedness, Level 5, crews and equipment get funneled toward whichever fires pose the most immediate threat to life and property. Big grass is burning across remote high desert rangeland with very few structures directly in its path, so every single morning, in the national coordination meetings that decide where crews go, it loses out to fires burning closer to homes and towns. On its own, that's the correct call. Nobody wants scarce crews pulled away from a fire bearing down on someone's house so they can be sent to open rangeland instead. But the side effect nobody designed for is exactly what's happening in eastern Oregon right now. Fires that threaten mostly open ground get left to burn largely unattended, which means they grow to an enormous S-size. Z, which means that by the time the wind eventually pushes them towards something that actually matters, a ranch, a highway corridor, a small town, they arrive not as a modest, containable blaze, but as a wall of flame stretching across hundreds of square miles. The fire's own official updates already contain that warning, D, describing extreme behavior with uphill runs, wind-driven pushes, and active threats to structures, communication infrastructure, and roads, all recorded in the same reports that list a firefighting force smaller than the staff of a single restaurant. So how does a fire cover more than 400 square miles in roughly 2 days? The answer sits in what's actually burning, and it flips almost everything people assume about wildfire in the Pacific Northwest. Picture a wildfire out here, and most people imagine dense, old-growth forest, towering trees, and a wall of orange climbing into the canopy. The fuel driving the big grass fire is nothing like that. It's brush and grass, some of it barely a couple of feet tall, and that matters more than the size of the vegetation ever could, because how fast a fire spreads through fine, dry fuel like grass depends almost entirely on wind speed and moisture, not on how much total energy is stored in the plants. A stand of mature timber holds a huge amount of potential energy, but it takes real time to dry out and ignite branch by branch. Dried grass sitting at extremely low humidity essentially ignites on contact. And B, earns through in seconds with almost no delay. Because there's no delay, the fire stops being limited by the vegetation itself and starts being limited only by the wind. Under sustained gusts in the 15 to 35 mile per hour range, blowing across continuous cured grass sitting at single-digit shio. Humidity? Exactly the kind of weather this region has seen repeatedly this month. A flame front can cover tens of miles in a single afternoon. That's how a fire goes from roughly 50,000 acres to over 200,000 acres between 2 mornings. It's not rare or exotic fire behavior. It's simple physics acting on a type of landscape most people never think of as dangerous. And the forecast isn't offering any relief. Federal fire weather outlooks this week continue to call for widespread, elevated to critical fire conditions across the inland Northwest, the Northern Rockies, and the Northern Great Basin, driven by the same pattern of gusty westerly winds, single-digit to 20% humidity, and triple-digit heat. Isolated dry thunderstorms are also in the forecast, which means new lightning. Used ignitions remain a real possibility even while existing fires are nowhere close to contained. This isn't a single bad weather day the region can absorb and bounce back from. It's the same dangerous pattern returning again and again, hammering an already overstretched region while the crews who would normally respond to brand new fire starts are already tied up elsewhere. Beyond Big Grass, Oregon alone has close to 100 large fires tracked at any given moment, ranging from smaller blazes under 30,000 acres up through several complexes well past the six-figure mark. Fires in Wheeler County, Harney County, and Jefferson County have each independently crossed 50,000 to 160,000 acres this season, and containment on several of them still sits in the single digits or low double digits weeks after ignition. What's know to be? Lee is how many of these fires share the same profile as Big Grass? Remote terrain, light staffing relative to their size, and fuel that's mostly grass and brush rather than timber. That pattern isn't a coincidence. It's the direct result of a state that's simultaneously fighting dozens of large fires, with a national resource pool that's already stretched to its ceiling everywhere else. Zoom out, and the picture across the rest of the Northwest fire list tells the same story in different fires. Several active blazes on national forest land in Oregon and Washington are showing extreme fire behavior, group torching, wind-driven runs, active threats to homes, and some currently have 0 PERS, unassigned. A handful of fires burning inside national park land in Washington show similar patterns, with estimated containment dates pushed all the way out to November, essentially betting that snowfall, not firefighters, will be what finally stops them. Meanwhile, several mid-sized Oregon fires are gaining tens of thousands of acres in a single day, even with Hugh, and dreads of people already assigned, showing that even fires with real staffing are struggling to keep pace with how fast this fuel type burns. Well over 100 structures have already been confirmed destroyed this season, and that number is expected to climb. The strain has grown severe enough that military aircraft have been pulled into the response, converting cargo planes into makeshift air tankers using a roll-on retardant system normally kept in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. That step isn't routine. It only gets triggered once the commercial air tanker contracts the country normally relies on are already fully booked and the civilian fire system formally asks the Department of Defense for backup. In other words, the country has already run through the aircraft it typically leases for this job and started converting military planes to fill the gap. Zoom out even further, and there's a genuinely uncomfortable detail hiding in the national numbers. Year to date, the country has recorded well over 40,000 individual fires, running noticeably above the 10-year average pace, with total acres burned also sitting above the historical average. But it's not a record-breaking, once-in-a-generation number. It's elevated, certainly running somewhere around a fifth above the typical pace, yet still nowhere near the worst seasons on record. And the country hit the top of its preparedness scale anyway. That gap is the real warning sign. This system didn't buckle under an extreme historic load. It buckled under a load that was only moderately above AV. Hair rage, because that load landed concentrated in one region instead of spread out evenly across the country. The entire mutual aid system the national fire response depends on assumes that when one area is overwhelmed, 9 others can send help. That's the exact thing that stopped functioning this year. To understand what a fire like this can do once it actually receives serious resources, look at the Kaiser Canyon fire burning on the Colville Reservation in north central Washington, close to the small community of Nespelem. It's Start D from a lightning strike in mid-July, and as of the most recent updates, has burned well past 120,000 acres, with containment sitting somewhere between roughly 10 and 15%. Unlike Big Grass, this fire did get real resources behind it, with several hundred personnel, dozens of F crews and engines, and a dedicated incident management team running the response. Even with all of that support, the fire has still outpaced containment efforts on more than one occasion, at times growing faster than crews could build fire line around it. The human toll on the reservation has been severe. More than 1,000 people were displaced under mandatory evacuation orders, with emergency shelters set up at a local high school. Multiple homes have been confirmed destroyed, along with dozens of additional structures like sheds, garages, and outbuildings. The fire has also burned across an area holding a significant number of culturally important sites for the Colville tribes, including carved trees and rock art passed down through generations. A historic cemetery near Nespelem was damaged with many grave markers scorched or destroyed, while a nearby and deeply significant historical burial site connected to a Nez Perce leader was fortunately spared. A small, long-standing community church in Nespelem, built by hand generations ago and belonging to a native Christian tradition with a shrinking congregation, was also destroyed in the fire, a loss that hit an already grieving community especially hard. There's one more detail that connects this fire directly back to the underlying science of why these landscapes keep burning. Not long before Kaiser Canyon ignited, tribal land managers had actually begun reseeding parts of that same canyon to restore native vegetation back. Oz it had already burned less than a year earlier. That new growth has now burned again less than 12 months later. That's not a coincidence, and it's exactly what researchers have been documenting across sagebrush and grasslands throughout the interior West, once fire strips out native perennial grasses. Yes, fast-growing invasive annual grasses tend to move in and take over the burn scar. Those invasive grasses cure earlier in the season and carry flame far more easily than what they replaced, which means ground that used to burn naturally once every few decades can start burning eve. Rye a year or two instead, locking the landscape into a much faster and more dangerous fire cycle than it evolved with. The reason Kaiser Canyon belongs in this story alongside big grass is simple. That's what a well-resourced fire response looks like. Hundreds of personnel, dedicated crews, aircraft, a professional man, agement team. And it's still barely holding its own against this year's conditions. Now, think about what a fire like big grass is capable of doing once the wind finally pushes it towards something that actually has people and homes in its path, with only a fraction of that support behind it. Smoke is how a fire that barely anyone is actively fighting still reaches people living hundreds of miles from the flames. Multiple counties across Washington and Oregon have been placed under air quality alerts this month with Monitor. Ing stations in some cities recording readings in the unhealthy to hazardous range. There's a pattern behind why smoke can actually get worse overnight, even as the visible fire calms down during daylight hours. During the day, rising heat lifts smoke plumes and helps disperse them, improving air quality. Once the sun sets and the ground decools, the air near the surface stabilizes, and that same smoke plume sinks and drains downhill into river valleys and low-lying towns, sometimes turning a moderate afternoon into a genuinely hazardous night in the exact same location. On top of that, much of the region has simultaneously been under heat advisories, and combining extreme heat with heavy smoke exposure creates health risks that researchers are still working to fully understand, though regional health officials have been direct about the combination amplifying danger to residents, especially those with existing respiratory or heart conditions. Behind every one of these statistics are real people, and this season has already cost lives among the firefighters themselves. In late June, a fast-moving wildfire along the Colorado-Utah border overran a group of firefighters during what's called a burnover, forcing them to deploy emergency fire shelters as a last resort. 3 of them did not survive, and 2 others suffered serious burn injuries. They were young, experienced wildland firefighters, each with their own story and their own reasons for choosing this work, and their deaths were formally recognized as line-of-duty losses, honored soon after at a memorial service attended by Honey. Dreads of fellow firefighters and grieving family members. The people currently being funneled into Oregon and Washington by the thousands come from that exact same national pool of firefighters, working the same brutal conditions, the same long shifts, and the same thin margins for error. Every number in this story, every percentage point of containment ultimately traces back to actual people standing between a fire and everything in its path, often for weeks at a stretch, with very little rest between assignments. So where does this go from here, and what's actually worth watching over the coming days? First, keep an eye on whether the big grass fire's acreage stabilizes or keeps climbing, and whether containment finally starts moving up from that stubborn 5% mark. Its own incident team has already filed an ES, time-aided containment date more than a week out, which tells you how long officials expect this one to keep burning. Second, watch the other regions currently sitting at moderate preparedness levels, because they're the exact pool that's been sending reinforcements north. If any of them spike upward at the same time, that support pipeline dries up in the middle of what's usually the most dangerous stretch of the entire fire season, which is still ahead. Third, pay attention to the containment dates incident teams have already filed on some of these fires, several stretching into October and November. Those aren't outside guess only. They're the working assumptions of the people actually running these incidents, and what they describe as a plan to still be fighting parts of this outbreak once the weather finally turns, rather than a plan to put them out directly. The larger point worth holding on to through all of this is that the National Wildfire System didn't collapse under some unprecedented, record-shattering season. It hit its limit under a load only moderately above the historical average, because that load landed almost entirely on 2 states instead of spreading out across the county. Awry the way the system was designed to handle. 2 states are currently holding roughly 2/3 of the nation's actively burning fire and roughly 2/3 of its deployed firefighters. The single largest fire on that list has around 65 people assigned to it, and the same dangerous wind and humidity pattern is forecast to return again this week. There's also a longer-term lesson buried inside all of these numbers, one that reaches beyond just this single season. Every time a landscape like the one around Big Grass or Kaiser Canyon burns and then reburns within a year or 2, it locks in a faster fire cycle for the years that follow, replacing slower-burning native vegetation with fuel that ignites earlier and spreads faster. That means the conditions driving this exact situation, sparse staffing on remote fires, fast-moving grass and brush fires outrunning containment. T-lines, and a preparedness system maxed out earlier each year, aren't necessarily a one-time event tied to this particular summer's weather. They may simply be what an increasing number of future fire seasons look like, unless something changes about how these landscapes recover between fires and how resources get distributed once the system hits its ceiling. None of that makes what's happening in Oregon and Washington right now any less serious. If anything, it raises the stakes on getting the response right this time, both for the communities currently under evacuation orders and for whatever comes next once this fire season eve unduly winds down. This story is far from finished, and the next few days of reports will show whether this is the peak of the strain or just the beginning of a much longer stretch. Keep watching the acreage numbers, keep watching the containment percentages, keep watching which region gets hit next once Oregon and Washington's reinforcements are stretched even thinner than they already are.